So welcome everyone. Again, I'm Carolyn Eswine. I'm co-chair of the Department of Urban Planning here at UW-Milwaukee. Thanks for joining us for our final lecture for the fall semester. I'm going to start with our land acknowledgement. We acknowledge in Milwaukee that we are on the traditional Potawatomi, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee homeland along the southwest shores of Michigamme, North America's largest system of freshwater lakes, where the Milwaukee, Menominee, and Kinnickinnic rivers meet, and the people of Wisconsin's sovereign Anishinaabe, Ho-Chunk, Menominee, and Oneida, and Mohican nations remain present. So we always encourage you to explore some of the resources that we have and deepen your knowledge and connections. So I just want to do a little highlight. We have four inspiring topics that we're exploring for the Spring Innovative Cities Lecture Series. So February 4th, we will have two folks talking about the economic impact of ecotourism, year-round destinations, covering two cities in Wisconsin. So we'll talk about Racine and La Crosse. March 4th, we're working on some speakers, probably have an environmental focus or technology. And then April 1st, we're going to tackle the housing challenges. So housing strategies to increase supply. We have a community from actually, this one is the La Crosse one, and we have a community from Minnesota. So for the tourism, we'll have Eau Claire highlighted along with Racine. So we'll have four, and we'll send those out to you in January so you can hold the dates. But please put these dates on your calendar, and then we'll have registration information that we share to you. And I'm going to pass to my co-chair, Bob Schneider, to introduce today's transit speakers.
All right, thanks so much, Carolyn. So today's topic is transit priority, improving public transit through collaboration. And we are honored to be joined by Kevin Muse. He's the city engineer at the city of Milwaukee, and Dan Adams, who's the planning manager with Milwaukee County Transit System. Kevin and Dan will be sharing how the city and county are working together through the Priority One initiative to bring together business leaders, transit agencies, local governments, and community partners to create a coordinated approach to strengthen the local economy while reducing barriers for residents. Well, we get into the presentation. Please post comments and questions in the chat, and then we'll have some time in the last 15 or 20 minutes for questions and discussion. So welcome, and I want to turn it over to Dan.
All right. Thank you very much, Bob. Thank you, Carolyn. And shout out to Natalie Brunner for helping coordinate and organize this. And if she's on, I know she's usually on top of posting helpful information in chat. So thank you, Natalie. So yeah, I'm here, Dan Adams, planning manager for Milwaukee County Transit System. I'm here to talk to you about transit priority and improving public transit through collaboration. I'll get into in a second here on what we mean by that. And I'm going to start with the beginning of the presentation, then kick it over to Kevin Muse from the city of Milwaukee, and then I'll have a little bit more at the end. All right, so very quick before we get into transit priority, a little bit of MCTS 101, kind of who we are and some key stats about us. So in 2024, Milwaukee County Transit System had just over 25 million rides in the system. So that's someone getting on a bus and taking it somewhere. That's a 13% increase over the prior year. And most importantly, represents recovery from the COVID kind of low point of ridership, which is a low point both in our system ridership-wise, but also across the country in all transit agencies and much of the world as well. And so that 25 million rides is getting roughly back to where we were in 2019, the year before COVID. It's still down from prior years. If you go back 5, 10, 15 years before that, ridership was much, much higher. But we are happy to see that recovery back to kind of pre-COVID numbers, ridership-wise. We also operate paratransit service. So that 25 million rides is our fixed route bus transit system. In 2024, we had roughly 350,000 paratransit rides. That's a service we contract out to provide paratransit van transportation services around the county and around our fixed route services. That all shakes out to around roughly 80,000 rides per day. All told, we have 46 routes, fixed routes in the system. At the time in 2024 that the slide is put together, our fleet was around 360 buses or so, give or minus a few. We're down a little bit for that as buses have been aging out of service and been rotating out. That includes our 14 battery electric buses, which operate on the Connect One bus rapid transit route, which I'll be talking about in a little bit. And then roughly in the system, we have around 3,700 bus stops across Milwaukee County, roughly 630 bus shelters as well. And so you probably have your regular bus stop and your shelters that you're familiar with. So that's MCTS 101, who we are as an agency and an organization. But what I'm here to talk to you about is one effort that we've been working on in cooperation with a number of partner organizations, most importantly, the city of Milwaukee, which is why Kevin and I are presenting here together today. And he'll talk a little bit more about that in a bit. But what is transit priority? So transit priority is a kind of a general term that's been used more and more across the industry in recent years, but it's a strategy and kind of approach to improve the public transit experience. And primarily when I'm talking about public transit, I'm talking about bus transit, because many of these things we're going to talk about are kind of naturally inherent in rail transit. But there are things you can do there as well. And some of these approaches apply to that. And the goal is really to improve the bus riding experience by designing streets and bus stops to support fast, frequent, and attractive transit service. So really what I'm talking about is a toolbox of interventions and strategies and infrastructure that really supports bus transit service and makes the experience better, both for operators, drivers, and the riders as well using that service. So I mentioned kind of a toolbox of interventions and infrastructure that kind of make up the idea of transit priority, which is ultimately about elevating and making bus transportation a priority on the streets and right of ways where they're going. So I'm going to go through these one by one, and I will say the photo on the screen here, this is one of the bus stops on our Connect One bus rapid transit route. If you put in the chat what stop this is, I will give you big kudos for being a big transit nerd or a dedicated rider. So feel free to throw that in there if you recognize this. So I'm going to start on the upper left here. So these are a variety of elements. It doesn't mean they have to all be used. It depends on the context and the situation and which of these you might deploy, what you might use. I'll talk a little bit in a bit what bus rapid transit is, and that's kind of more of a package of these various elements. So on the upper left here, we talk about stop spacing. So traditionally, transit in the United States looked at as little as a stop every eighth of a mile, or in Milwaukee, historically, it was every 2 blocks you would have a stop. That results in a lot of stopping to pick up and drop off passengers, slowing down service. So looking at ways we can maybe expand that stop spacing a bit or look at efficiencies as far as how we're locating stops with regard to destinations and transfer points and things like that can provide efficiencies for how quickly a bus can move across the system and move across the city. Lighting and shelters, that's kind of self-explanatory. However, there's improvements you can make in new designs with regard to shelters to make the waiting experience more comfortable, to make it feel safer, thus enticing more people to use transit and to ride the bus. If the waiting experience is going to be better, you're going to feel better about that walk to the bus stop and the few minutes you'll have to wait before you actually step on the bus to get to your destination. The rest of these are things that kind of come in a package. Not necessarily, they don't have to be a package, but we have with regard to our bus rapid transit service and line, the Connect One. So on the bottom left, near level boarding, which in this photo is where you see that yellow kind of detectable warning strip, we call it, the yellow strip along the elevated curb there where the bus pulls up. So if you think about a train, when a train pulls into a station, you generally step off, there are exceptions, but you generally step off at the same level onto the platform that the train is at. Meaning it means for quick boarding or alighting, which is what we call getting off a vehicle. Also means the vehicle does not have to kneel. All of our buses are equipped to kneel to make it easier for people to get on and off the bus. But if you have near level boarding like this, you don't have to kneel the bus, which saves time. And people with mobility devices are able to get on and off the bus much quicker, thus speeding up service for everybody using it. In-lane boarding. So you can kind of make out underneath the bus in this photo, it says only, and then behind there it would say bus only. I'm sorry. In-lane boarding. I'll get to dedicated bus lanes in a second. So in-lane boarding, traditionally most bus stops, you pull to the curb out of traffic, usually in a parking lane, to board and alight passengers at the curb, and then have to pull back into traffic to merge back into traffic. That again takes time, slowing down bus service on the street. In-lane boarding means the bus is stopping in a travel lane, meaning it does not have to merge out and merge back in, again, saving time while you're traveling. Uh, in this picture right here, we have inlane boarding on Wisconsin Avenue. So this lane right here, this dedicated bus lane, which I'll talk about in a second, allows the bus just to continue its normal path of travel, board in a light passengers, and continue straight ahead without merging in and out of traffic. Bottom right, dedicated bus lanes. So dedicated bus lanes mean a travel lane in the right of way on the street or road that is dedicated solely for transit vehicles, buses. So in Milwaukee, we have dedicated bus lanes on Wisconsin Avenue, and a little bit on Hawley as well, on the west side for the Connect One bus rapid transit line. There are different ways you can deploy dedicated bus lanes. In Milwaukee, we just have paint, so striping on the street and signage saying this lane is only for buses and transit vehicles. But you can even do different types of striping. It's common to see red paint in transit lanes. So I'll show an example of one in a second here in a nearby city. But you can also have vertical separation. So some type of physical barrier restricting other vehicles from entering that lane to, interfere with transit travel and operations. And then above our bus here in the photo, we have two more. I'll start with the real-time display. So real-time display is pretty self-explanatory, and you can see it in the middle of the slide here, where we have a scrolling real-time display, which tells you when your next bus is coming to the stop. There's different styles from essentially TVs to these to e-ink. There's actually some e-ink real-time displays out on the Milwaukee Regional Medical Campus here in Milwaukee that you can see and use. And this simply allows riders to know when their next bus is coming. Because the most anxious part of riding transit is waiting and wondering when your vehicle is coming. So if you can look at a sign and it tells you, oh, a bus is coming in 2 minutes, you're going to feel much more comfortable and you're going to feel more confident that you're going to get to your destination. And this last portion that I've saved, signal optimization, and Kevin's more of a specialist than this and could probably speak more at length at it. But signal optimization is about a lot of the time on a bus route. We call it dwell time, where you're stopped and not actually moving in traffic. And that can be dwell time because you're stopped at a stop picking up and letting off passengers. But a lot of that is at intersections, red lights, congestion, things like that. And there's certain things you can do at intersections with signals to allow buses to get through quicker, thus speeding up the overall route travel time and speeding up operations. And there's a variety of types of signal optimizations, from types of technology that senses a bus coming and it might hold a green light for an extra 2 or 3 seconds to make sure the bus can get through, to technologies that allow queue jumping, which allows a bus to kind of pull through an intersection before the rest of the traffic gets through, and then the light changes green, as well as other interventions as well. So all these together are some of the toolbox that makes up transit priority. And these are different elements that, deployed in different combinations and in different locations, ultimately makes for a better transit and bus ride and speeds up service, making it more attractive to bus riders. Typically, historically in the United States, this has been deployed as part of bus rapid transit as a large package. And that is what we've done here with Milwaukee County Transit with our Connect One bus rapid transit route, which is featured in the photo right here. It runs east and west between downtown Milwaukee and the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center on the west side of the county. We've included most of these elements in that service. However, the reason we're talking about transit priority today and not just bus rapid transit is because these elements can be deployed individually or in smaller groups, depending on the local context on a street, depending on the resources available, and depending on projects being taken to redesign and reconstruct streets, which is really where collaboration comes into play. And just for reference, for a few examples, kind of locally in the Midwest in the US, at this point, almost every city in the United States that has a large transit agency has developed or deployed some level of transit priority infrastructure and elements on their streets. But locally here, Madison has recently launched their first bus rapid transit line, which goes east to the west side of the city through the Isthmus. They're working on their next one, maybe 2 bus rapid transit lines, which deploy a lot of the elements, actually probably most or all of them, that I described in the prior slide. Indianapolis to our south, they run two bus rapid transit lines in their system, in the Indigo system, which have been very successful and include things like you can see in these photos, the red painted bus only lanes, these dedicated stations with near level boarding. You can see in the Madison photo, they have their real-time displays, as well as, I didn't even talk in the prior thing, off-board fare collection. So you could buy a ticket before even getting on the bus, thus speeding up kind of boarding time as well. And so those were rolled out as dedicated bus rapid transit lines, routes across the system. However, the two cities on the bottom are examples of ones that don't have dedicated bus rapid transit lines, or at least not that I'm aware of. I'm sure there's folks, if I'm getting that wrong, that'll let me know in the chat. But I don't believe Chicago or DC have branded bus rapid transit lines right now, but they have deployed a number of those elements all across their systems in various fashions. So the photo from Chicago here shows down in the loop. If anyone's been down there has seen that, they have the bus only lanes. They have these larger improved shelters. They have near level boarding. They have the real-time travel signs. In DC, they've deployed a lot. DC, if you've been in DC in the last 2 or 3 years, they seem to have bus only lanes on half their streets in the center city. So they have a lot of bus transit priority elements. They have these elevated boarding pads, everything we've been talking about here. And so these are good examples of, depending on the local context, you might use some of these elements, you might use others, but you don't always have to deploy them as one package. So I've kind of described what we're talking about with regard to transit priority and bus rapid transit. And from our standpoint, Milwaukee County Transit System, we bring the transit service, the buses, the operation of the buses, and all that. However, we operate pretty much exclusively on others' streets and roads. So that's where I'd like to hand it over to Kevin Muse to talk about the collaboration, the back and forth that has to happen, and the close working relationship that we have to work on some of these transit priority projects.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. So as Dan said, I'm Kevin Muse. I serve as the city engineer for the city of Milwaukee, which is makes me the director of the Infrastructure Services Division of Department of Public Works. Um, so who's working on transit priority? As Dan said, this has got to be a collaborative effort. So I first wanted to start and just note two planning efforts, one by the city and one by Sewer Pack, neither of which were DPW products that are really guiding this work. And so the Southeastern Wisconsin Regional Planning Commission several years ago now completed Vision 2050, which articulates a long-range vision for transportation and land use in the seven-county region. But in that transportation portion of that vision is a backbone public transit network, and in particular, an identification of corridors that deserve this type of investment from the Regional Planning Commission's perspective and deserve to be considered transit priority corridors. This document it's not necessarily that we're looking at it and we're exactly implementing what SewerPack is recommending, but the concepts and the thought of network thinking and approaching this not necessarily just from the perspective of, okay, we need to build 7 or 8 BRT lines, but we need to identify places where we're going to make transit move faster and give transit the priority within a certain context is really baked into that document. Within the core of the region's transit network and the core of the network operated by MCTS, that almost all runs through downtown Milwaukee. And so another thing that's been very essential and critical to moving this vision forward has been the connecting MKE, the latest, I think it's the third generation of the downtown plan, which was produced by my colleagues at the Department of City Development in partnership with the Downtown Business Improvement District. And so that document, for the first time ever in its history, in its recent adoption, its third generation, spent a lot of time and effort talking about the transportation network downtown in a fair amount of detail. And we were involved in that discussion with our colleagues at the Department of City Development when that was being articulated. And so that has led to again, a planning level, network level thinking on what corridors we're going to use for what in downtown. So That's kind of the framework we're working within. As Dan said, MCTS operates the system, right? They bring the buses, they bring the fare policy, they bring the service to the public, but they're operating on rights of way that are owned by the city of Milwaukee and other municipalities in Milwaukee County and beyond, and also the State Department of Transportation, WSDOT. And so, one thing that has also occurred and was enabled by the planning efforts I just talked about, but also just some change, the change in administration, Mayor Johnson becoming the mayor at the city is a rethink regarding the city's role in transit. Obviously, we've got the hop, we have the streetcar, and that's certainly a pretty significant foray within downtown for the city into transit in a way we haven't in the past. But it's also a rethink on the fact that MCTS is bringing the buses, but we control the environment they're operating in. And so that's been a shift internally and strategically within the city and within DPW. And that's kind of what has led to this greater partnership when we're doing our street redesign projects. Um, and I don't want to diminish WSDOT's role in this at all. So I want to note when we do start talking about kind of the core of this network, multiple portions of this network carry state connecting highway traffic, which means that any major capital project on those streets is going to be initiated and led by the State Department of Transportation. They've been very good partners with us in thinking about how do we make sure that the bus can move as fast as possible and serve the public as best as possible within the physical infrastructure elements that that the street design can control with those projects. And so I'll highlight a couple of those as well. Yeah, next slide. So this slide is a kind of a FYI. Some folks know this, but I don't think this is always obvious to people. So who does what in the public right of way? So MCTS owns and manages the bus stop signs and most of the shelters that you see across the city of Milwaukee and the county. If you see a particularly unique shelter other than a Connect One shelter, it's likely that there's some sort of partnership that is maintaining and may even own that shelter. But most of the standard ones, which I call, Dan can correct me, I call the bubble tops, the plastic bubbles on top, and then also the ones with the arched roof and the black frames. Those are all owned by MCTS. The local municipalities, like the city of Milwaukee, Milwaukee County, or the State Department of Transportation, own and manage the right of way. So the streets, the roads, the highways. In most of the city, the best way to think about this is it's roughly within a foot or so of the outside of the sidewalk on either side. So outside the sidewalk, all the way in, that is the responsibility of one of these entities, depending on which street you're on. And so really what we're doing with this transit priority concept is, and it's not something like we're leading innovation across the country on this. It's more about the systems change and the strategic thinking within these organizations and institutions, of taking a look at where MCTS has good service, where MCTS is prioritizing a lot of frequency, where we think maybe in the future we might be prioritizing a lot of frequency under a positive scenario for transit funding in the region, and using street reconstruction projects and other opportunities, smaller grants that don't come as one large check from the Federal Transit Administration like a BRT project does, to bring those BRT-like elements that Dan talked about, those transit priority elements, into a corridor where there might be multiple bus routes operating over the corridor. So that's what we're trying to do here is think strategically, think on a network scale while implementing individual projects over time. Next slide. So a great example of this, and mostly I'm showing this because I like the pretty picture, is our Water Street project. We actually have, and a map will be shown on the next slide here, but we have three separate large capital projects coming in the course of multiple years here on Water Street and South First Street. And this corridor is a significant north-south spine for the transit system. This is by no means like a comprehensive description of the transit system, but when you're in downtown, Your east-west spine is largely Wisconsin Avenue. Your north-south spines are 6th Street and Water Street. And so we have these three streets that transit is really a key part of the transportation network. And from a vehicle moving perspective, a dominant part of the large vehicles that are operating on the street. And so with this opportunity, to look at Water Street between this particular project that this rendering is from is between Kilbourne Avenue and Pleasant Street. So looking at almost a mile of Water Street here, starting downtown and heading to the northern edge of it, and to the Lower East Side. We have an opportunity to rethink the allocation of the street space and rethink how we're prioritizing transit. So this is a great example of there's not a BRT project here, but we are going to have in this corridor, our current plan is to have dedicated center running bus lanes, the first center running bus lanes in the region, actually. And we are probably going to use some red concrete or red paint to delineate the space. We're looking at places where we might actually have some grade separation. So there might be a slight difference in height between the lanes to, again, affirm for drivers of standard automobiles that they're not supposed to be in those bus lanes. You can see in this rendering, island boarding platforms, very similar to what the streetcar has, to give people waiting for transit a separate space to be in that doesn't conflict with people biking or walking, and reallocating that street space. So reducing and eliminating the weaving that you get right now on Water Street, where the buses are pulling in and out of the right-hand lane for the most part. So that's better for drivers, but also taking a little bit of space away from drivers to give it to transit to make things move a little faster. We don't have the signal solution totally sorted yet on this project, but I want to talk about it even though we don't have the solution, because we are MCTS did get a small grant, a congestion mitigation and air quality grant, to outfit some of their vehicles with the transponders we need, the emitters we need to help those buses communicate with our signal system. And so we're laying the groundwork through multiple funding sources. The design of this project is funded by the city's tax increment district for the Park East. And so that's, the city bringing some resources through the capital resources we have largely within or near downtown, MCTS finding a small grant, and then once this project eventually moves to construction, another large investment from the city to make that happen. Next slide. So where are we doing this? So these streets, as I mentioned, are we're not just doing this downtown, but there's a lot of intricate pieces downtown. So that's why the map is focusing on downtown. So the first one of these streets in the region was a quote unquote traditional BRT project led by MCTS in the county, a large capital project. Connect One BRT from downtown Milwaukee to the Milwaukee Regional Medical Center and many points in between. That was a single large grant garnered from the Federal Transit Administration with some local match. These other projects on this street are on this screen are all taking a different path to try to get to similar results, at least within the portions of the projects that are highlighted, or the corridors that are highlighted. So 27th Street, the county just succeeded recently in getting a build grant, which for some targeted transit investment improvements, not a full BRT, but looking at investing in stops, looking at investing in signals, looking at making small investments to make the purple line run faster, which is either the busiest or second busiest bus route. Second, all right, thanks, Dan. Keep me honest. Second busiest bus route in the system. Downtown, it's more about the fact that, and MCTS's automatic vehicle location data will tell you this, the buses slow down a lot through downtown. It's by far the slowest part of the system. All the signals are very close together. The streets are more crowded. There's a lot going on. The buses are also, I'm trying to come up with a word that isn't bumping into each other because they're not hitting each other, but the buses are causing their own congestion with each other as well, because there's a lot of routes that overlap in some of these stretches. And so what I'm trying to get at here is to emphasize that what we're trying to do is for people who are trying to get to downtown and people who are on these bus routes going through downtown. Thank you, David. Bus bunching. That's the term I was struggling to come up with. The riders that are going through downtown, we're trying to reduce that slowdown you have in downtown and keep the buses moving on these key corridors where there's a lot of routes combined. So just taking them down the list on the left here. So North Water Street and South First Street, these are really one corridor, but there's actually three separate capital projects that are in this area. So I just talked about the stretch from Kilbourne to Pleasant. We have a break that we're still figuring out how we're going to fund from Kilbourne down to Clybourne. But then we have a funded project that should go to construction in 2027 in the third ward from Clybourne down to Erie Street and really the Milwaukee River. And so we're looking at how do we keep the bus moving along this entire corridor, whether it's bus lanes in some locations, signals and others, queue jumps as part of the signal system, stop consolidation, looking at stop amenities and enhancements like some of those that Dan mentioned that might speed up the boarding process or at least make it more pleasant for the rider, and keep the buses moving through this slower stretch. That concentration of multiple high-frequency transit routes overlapping each other continues south of the river. So through the Harbor District, through Walker's Point and south, there's a lot of additional investments that could be made. And we're working right now with, there's a state connecting highway because it's State Highway 32 on South First Street. There's a state connecting highway project that we just started public outreach on, where one of the alternatives that we're trying to move forward would consider giving dedicated bus lanes on the right side, not against the curb, but either against the curb or next to the parking lane, depending on the context in that corridor. And again, that's part of, it may not make sense when you think about it, as an eighth of a mile or a quarter or a mile or a half mile here. But when you put this together, we're taking the three slowest miles of those north-south routes and trying to speed them up. Sixth Street is another great example. That is one large project. Of course, I think most folks probably know that we lost that grant relatively recently during a congressional rescission. And so we are still continuing the design process on that. That is funded. We'll be working to determine what that turns into. It's unlikely to be one big project. So it'll be a lot like what I just described for Water and First Street, where we're probably going to have 2, 3, 4 different construction projects. There's state connecting highway on 6th Street in the middle of it. So there's a lot of different potential funding partners we're looking at to try to keep that project moving forward. And again, figure out how we keep buses moving through that corridor and what that'll look like. Then finally, the state has initiated outreach on and has upcoming sometime in the next 5 to 7 years, a reconstruction on Prospect and Farwell. And same thing, big transit route in the city, much like 27th Street, one of the busier, densest parts of the city, has a lot of transit riders on it. And we also hope, if MCTS's funding situation gets better in the future, that it'll be served by more than one bus route in the future again, or at least a much more frequent Route 30. And so we are looking at what that might look like in the future and how we can prioritize transit on those streets as well. And then I'll just talk on these briefly because Dan talked about how it's kind of a kit of parts, right? So we also have smaller projects that maybe aren't the routes or aren't the places where we got multiple high frequency routes overlapping, but still have good, robust transit service, where we're combining a project that's primarily a safety project from the city's perspective, pedestrian safety, bike safety, safety for people driving. But we're trying to look at where we can, within that corridor, help the bus system out too. And so that includes, and primarily what we've been doing is doing in-lane boarding at select locations so that the bus doesn't have to weave in and out of the moving travel lane, and therefore it helps speed up the transit service for the bus and the transit riders. The other reason I like that from a safety perspective, as the city engineer, is that allows me to use the bus as the pace vehicle in that corridor as well. And so a lot more drivers are following the speed of the bus as it goes down the street, which is almost always a nice, safe speed. And so that's another reason that we're doing this, and another benefit from our perspective. Next slide. So what does this mean for the future of transit in Milwaukee? So as I think I already highlighted, we are trying to be as collaborative as we can be. And I think we've taken it to new heights compared to the past across agencies, across the city of Milwaukee, our DPW and DCD with MCTS and WSDOT to really think about how we can use different ways and many different funding streams and interventions to speed up and improve transit service. And this includes obviously focusing on the street projects that we control at the city. But there is a but here, which is that there's kind of an expectation from the city that in most circumstances, if we're going to provide a dedicated bus lane, there is a bus coming every 5 to 7 minutes in that corridor. That's generally our preference as the city. And so this conversation around how are we going to fund transit for the future in Milwaukee, which is critical to the future of the city. Every dense urban environment needs a transit spine and backbone to make the economy work. We cannot have everyone driving. We don't want everyone driving, but we also just cannot. Physically, the geometry does not work. And so we need to have a strong transit system for the economic success of the city. It's really important to us. And therefore, this conversation about how we're going to sustain MCTS going forward is very critical to this conversation around transit priority as well. I'll turn it back over to Dan. Oop, you're still on mute, Dan.
Good looking out. Thank you. Thank you, Kevin. So as Kevin mentioned, if you're going to make the investments that we've been describing here that are the kit of parts of the toolbox for transit priority, you're going to want to leverage those investments with frequent transit service, meaning the bus is coming by very frequently to the point where you don't even have to check a schedule. You walk up to the stop and within a few minutes, you're on a bus and going. And Kevin mentioned the 5 to 7 minutes ideally. Some of these corridors he talked about, so especially 6th Street and Water Street, at peak times right now, we have buses coming every 2, 3, 4, 5 minutes because of the number of routes that come through and serve those corridors, which really takes advantage and maximizes those investments. However, if you've been paying attention, watching the news, MCTS has some financial challenges right now. It's a fairly serious one. So what I have on the screen right now is just a quote from the Milwaukee County Comptroller's 2026 recommended budget. Is kind of their overview of it. It's a lot of words on the screen. Sam, I'm sorry for that. I think I saw Sam White's on. But sometimes you just got to highlight it with some text. So this year for 2026, going into the 2026 budget year, MCTS is facing a just over $14 million budget deficit going into 2026. This is all very fluid. This was from the recommended budget a few months ago. So that's obviously evolved since then. The county board found a few dollars, I think $4.7 million to put towards MCTS's next budget next year. But as a result of this, we are already facing cuts and service reductions going into this new year, into 2026. And this is a structural deficit, meaning we are facing this deficit every year for the future. So all the conversation and most of what you see in the news right now is related to our upcoming 2026 budget, but we are going to be seeing a larger budget deficit in 2027. I don't have that exact number as far as what they're forecasting at the moment. So this is an ongoing structural problem. And so without addressing this issue, we're going to run into a situation where we're going to be forced to reduce service each year, which is really going to challenge us to how do we meet these service kind of standards and the frequency standards we want to maintain to fully take advantage of any of these elements that we've been talking about in this presentation today. And just for your knowledge, because we get this question a lot, what does the MCTS budget pie look like? Both the revenue and our costs, what are we actually spending the money on? So I'll start on the left side here, our revenue by source. You can see we get a chunk, roughly a quarter from local sources through the county budget. This is our 2024 budget. It changes slightly every year, but this is pretty similar to what it's been the last few years. 20% or a little more from the feds. And then a big chunk, almost 40% comes from the state government. In 2024, we made this our fare box recovery. So the amount of our revenue we generate directly from riders paying to ride the bus was 14%. That's gone down a little bit since then, although we'll have 2025 numbers as we get into the new year. And that's actually above the average for the US. Most large agencies, fare box recovery is below that. So that's kind of our revenue, where the monies are coming from. And the one takeaway from this is, and I'll talk about some comparisons to other agencies in a slide here, but the portion of our funding that comes from the state versus local funding sources is very, very different than most transit agencies in the country. Most transit agencies in the country, the large majority of the revenue comes from a local funding source and a dedicated funding source, which I'll talk about in a minute. And that's typically, most commonly probably a sales tax, but there's other versions, payroll taxes and other things, hotel taxes, stuff like that. But that generally makes up the majority of the revenue for most transit agencies in the United States. And then what is that money going to? So in 2024, our total budget for running the system was $176 million. The largest cost for any transit agency is the driver, the operator in the seat of the vehicle. And so that's the bus operation side. Over half of our total cost of operating the transit system. You can see paratransit, maintenance, capital. Capital generally for MCTS means replacing buses. Other agencies that might have more infrastructure on the street that might be a little larger for that, but for us it's generally buses. And then 12% is everyone behind the scenes, the administration who makes the system work and run, like myself. So I talked a little about comparison to other agencies. So I would point you in the direction of a 2023 report by the Wisconsin Policy Forum called Detour Ahead, which compared MCTS to, I think it was 10 peer systems across the country on a number of different statistics and how we kind of stack up, as well as some prior reports were prepared by Sewer Pack in prior years, looking at how other transit systems are funded in comparison to Milwaukee as well. But a few things I wanted to just point out on this slide. The first item in this quote up here, it addresses what I mentioned on the prior slide about the amount of our revenue that comes from a local source. And you can see here our 20% of local source is the lowest out of the 10 peer systems that the Wisconsin Policy Forum looked at. And this was back in 2019, but that really hasn't changed much since then. And then how efficient and effective we are with the funds we get. The Wisconsin Policy Forum looked at a number of different metrics, cost effectiveness, cost per vehicle revenue hour, and MCTS routinely ranked at or near the top with regard to how efficient and effective they are with the dollars they have. So cost effectiveness MCTS fixed route bus service ranked first among 10 peer systems in 2015, dropped a little bit to third in 2021. But this last one, I really like this last quote, saying that MCTS's 2021 cost per vehicle revenue hour of just over $102 was nearly $30 cheaper than the average across those 10 peer systems. And the reason I say this is because as we're facing these fiscal challenges, there will be a lot of, rightfully so, a lot of questions asked about what can MCTS do to become more efficient and better stewards of the public dollars that we use to run our transit system. And I share this information simply to point to, while we're always striving to be as efficient as possible, it gets to a point where your only option to fit within your allocated budget means cutting service, cutting routes. And that's what we're starting to see right now. And that's what's playing out in and was actually today, the Milwaukee County Transportation Transit Committee meeting was this morning where they were talking about exactly this. And so the reason we're hitting onto these issues is MCTS does not have a dedicated funding source going into our budget, which is why our local portion is so small. And by dedicated funding source, I mean some source of revenue that is set aside and every year dedicated to the transit agency. Because if I go back to our pie here, this revenue sources, the local, federal, and the state, that's in many ways at the whim of those elected officials at those different levels. If they decided not to fund MCTS at that level for a year, we would be out of that portion of our funding pie and facing some very dire situations. Milwaukee and Milwaukee County Transit System is one of the only large transit agencies left in the United States that does not have a dedicated funding source. We used to always point to Nashville as the other one. We'd say Nashville, is the other example of a large city and a large transit agency, although they run far less service than we do today, although they're planning on expanding. However, Nashville passed a referendum, a transportation and transit referendum, about a year ago, I think, maybe a little over that, for over $3 billion to fund their system, which included a dedicated funding source for the transit agency, meaning that they can plan into the future with an expectation of what their budget could be every year and plan out an expansion of their system. Without that dedicated funding source, we are just operating budget cycle to budget cycle. And so to be able to live up to our side of the expectations with regard to transit priority, we really need a dedicated funding source for Milwaukee County Transit to allow us to plan for the future and be able to serve the city with the level of public transit that I think we all feel and agree we should have as a city. So what can you do to support transit? Well, first of all, talk to your elected officials, whether it's the County Board of Supervisors or the state legislators. Actually, a lot of the power in this situation lies with the state legislature, and we could do an entire different presentation just about the funding side of all this. But let them know that transit is important to you. They need to hear from constituents that transit matters and transit is something important to you and your community. Support efforts to create a source of funding that's dedicated for MCTS so that we can plan future routes and hopefully expansions. I already mentioned about comparative to other cities and agencies across the country. And then also support street reconstruction projects, as Kevin described, that prioritize transit, safe streets, and traffic calming. Because if we make the built environment supportive to public transit, that just makes the argument stronger that we should be investing in that public transit moving forward. Those two things work together and in symbiosis. So with that, I think we're almost right on time, what we were hoping for. I have some websites up on the screen, some resources. For both on our side, there's our general website, riotmcts.com. I'd like to put in a plug for our relatively new merch store, mctsstore.com. The holiday season is coming up. If you want to get your loved ones and friends or fellow transit nerds a holiday sweater, a transit-themed holiday sweater, please check that out. And Kevin, I don't know if you want to plug your sites up on the site here.
I just want to know why you're not wearing that sweater, Dan.
I haven't been gifted it yet, Kevin.
There we go. All right, I'll keep that in mind. Just to note for everybody that, and actually you can just Google this. If you Google Milwaukee DPW projects, it'll take you right there too, because that's kind of a long title. We do have two sites. So one, DPW projects website is for everything that is under construction or coming soon. And Engage MKE, engage.milwaukee.gov is primarily used for things that are in design and on their way. But if we do have a large construction project, it also has an Engage page as well. So that's where you can interact with all of DPW's street and right-of-way projects.
Well, thank you so much to both of you. You packed an incredible amount of information into that time, and we have some great questions in the chat. And I want to take the next 10 minutes to address them. There's really two big categories that I see coming in the questions. One has to do with the funding, so I want to ask about that first. The other one has to do about with the design in the street corridors and some of the challenges that need to be overcome in doing that. But let's start on the funding side, since you were talking about that, Dan, and gave such a great overview. Since this is a planning audience and we have really important need for policy and planning understanding, can you talk a little bit about the sort of the legal mechanics that are needed to provide the funding sources that we're talking about, whether it be an RTA or something else to increase the funding resources for Milwaukee County, but also since it's a statewide audience, what implications are there at the state level to other transit agencies besides MCTS? And either one of you can address, but Dan.
Yeah, thank you, Bob. I'll start real quick, and then Kevin actually probably has more extensive knowledge on some of this than I do. So I think the first thing I'd like to say is there's kind of two funding challenges. The first is our immediate funding challenges, which is, this annual budget deficit that we're facing, which is leading to us having to propose service reductions. And so in the immediate term, we need to solve that funding gap in the 2026 budget, the 2027 budget, and so forth. However, there's the ongoing kind of structural deficit, which is what I spoke to about with regard to finding a dedicated funding source so that we can have a stable, sustainable funding source that allows us to plan and expand in the future. And those I tend to think of as almost two different things. One is like the emergency, how do we really plug the gaps in the next 2, 3, 4 years? And then the other one is the long term, how do we kind of stabilize things so that we're a more stable and self-sufficient, sustainable system going forward. With regard to the actual legal mechanics and what can be done, Kevin, would you mind, just because I've heard you explain it before and you do it much more eloquently than I?
Okay, sure. Uh, um, I think the big thing is that it is really, or it really could be a statewide conversation, as you alluded to, Bob. The way, as Dan mentioned, the way we fund transit is atypical in Wisconsin. The state government provides a lot of support, which is great, but we're also very dependent on it. And starting roughly 2005 or so, the state stopped, I would say, upholding their end of the bargain. And so that funding no longer increases with any regular rate of inflation, nor with the inflation that are leading to the structural deficit that Dan just talked about. And so a couple choices. So one is the state could just go back to upholding their end of the bargain and start funding transit at a reasonable level again. That was how it worked, and it worked that way for a solid 30 years without too much issue in the state. Um, uh, but that doesn't necessarily solve what might be a capital funding challenge if we want to make a big investment, like the HOP was, or something even larger, more expansive than the HOP. And so that might need an additional funding source anyways, even if the state does bump back up their end of the bargain. So the other piece is state statute changes. So we need kind of one or two things there, either flexibility for the units of government who own transit systems to implement some sort of dedicated funding source on their own, which right now state statutes in Wisconsin are very restrictive towards counties and municipalities regarding what revenue can be raised, and what sources can be used. We're very atypically restrictive in the state on that, or enabling regional transit authorities, and setting up a cross-border, cross-boundary entity to own, operate the transit system, and theoretically also again be able to have its own dedicated funding source as part of that structure. So those are some options that we could advocate for.
And Dan, there's a request for you to flip back to the slide that says what you can do to follow up on that particular point. Yeah, thanks to both of you for the answers there. Moving on to some of the sort of technical aspects of the design of these corridors, there's some questions related to how do you overcome certain challenges? For example, trade-offs with street parking, concerns about traffic congestion, state route approvals, and mobility versus access on those corridors. So I guess, Kevin, would you talk about those first? And if Dan, you have anything to add, go ahead.
Sure, yeah, happy to. Um, the parking is the biggest challenge for us politically at the city. That's the thing that the alders hear the most about. It's the thing we hear the most about when we're adjusting parking, making really any changes to it, even if they're modest. And so we are very sensitive to that. We try to capture data, look at how often the parking is used, when it is being used, and why. Is it primarily for a residential use or for a commercial use? Are there other places people could be parking? What's the relative benefit of the improvement we're proposing that would take away parking? So as an example, looking at the various projects across the Water Street corridor right now. So on the northern segment from Kilbourne up to Pleasant, that is a very wide right of way. And so we're going to be able to maintain parking basically as it is today, with minimal impacts under that project for the most part. In contrast, we aren't proposing dedicated lanes through the Third Ward segment of that project, and that's primarily because of parking demand and the interest of the stakeholders right along the street there, in having what they wanted, the shortest street to cross possible. So they wanted that pedestrian safety. That was the focus. They want to widen out the sidewalks, but they really weren't interested in stomaching the loss of parking along that stretch, and not just parking, I should say, the loading zones. The west side of the street on Water Street does not have an alley. Those riverfront buildings do rely on Water Street and all those businesses rely on Water Street for their truck loading and unloading and Uber Eats pickups and all that type of stuff, right? So that's really the core there and the key there. It's not individual spots, but it's that curbside use. And so we're looking at other improvements like to signals and those sorts of things that we can do there. Moving on to operations, that's always a sensitive thing to think about. We try to balance that. Really, this ties directly into the next thing you were asking about, Bob, with the state, which is that we have different standards for operations than the state does. And that's the biggest difference between a state-led project and a city-led project is that the state has specific level of service, it's called standards that they need to meet, which are basically measurements of how much delay, primarily at traffic signals, that someone is going to experience in a car. And they've got those standards. We are able to be a little bit more flexible. It's not like we ignore operations. We think about operations too. And we do try to be careful. Our goal is not to gridlock downtown, right? So we want to make sure that it continues to work for every user, including people driving around the city. But we are willing to maybe push a little bit harder into specific times of day when it might be a little bit more challenging. It might take you an extra minute or something like that to get through a corridor in your car. We're more comfortable with that than the state is. So that's kind of the main difference between those two. The other thing with the state is they have different truck turning standards than we do, which the easiest way I can describe that is that it changes the size of the intersection. And so the truck turning, the larger the truck you need to get through an intersection, the bigger the intersection has to be, the less we can slow down automobile cars using the curbs and those types of things, and the longer the crosswalk has to be, the crossing has to be for somebody walking.
There was also a question related to some of these transit priority improvements that are currently planned as bus lanes or dedicated bus service. Could that be expanded or changed to streetcar at some point in the future?
We are trying to think about that. It is a little challenging given the restrictions implemented under Act 12, which was the 2023 Act 12, which was the one that enabled the city and the county to implement their sales taxes, or in the case of the county, increase sales tax. We have many fewer options for funding streetcar expansion in the city after that. That could always change in the future, right? That was an act of the state legislature. The state legislature can act differently in the future. And so we are trying to be thoughtful about that, but we are not permitted to spend levy-backed dollars, which is our standard capital dollars, or tax increment district capital dollars, which is the other way we often do these projects, on streetcar-related items. So it's more about just being thoughtful about what we're putting in the hopes of minimizing the amount of tearing up we might have to do in the future if the HOP is expanded.
We have time for just one last question. I want to follow up related to this. Are there any safety impacts that you've seen in other communities doing these transit priority improvements for all roadway users, pedestrians, bicyclists, other motor vehicle users? And what would we expect from these in Milwaukee?
Dan, you want to go first?
Oh, well, I was just going to say, I mean, as we mentioned earlier in the presentation, there's a fair amount of overlap between traffic calming and street safety measures and the stuff that supports robust transit use and transit service. So there are definitely safety measures, to the specific metrics. I'm sure Kevin could speak to it better. But I mean, some of the example photos we had showed combined bike infrastructure, transit infrastructure, and what I would call pedestrian infrastructure because it shortens crossings, provides more visibility for people crossing the street and things like that. And I know some people have done a fair amount of work on looking at the actual data. I'm looking at you, Bob, at how it actually makes it safer for all users of the street. But yeah, okay, if Kevin has anything to add.
Yeah, just I guess Dan, you said it exactly right. So I'll just add that we have collected before and after speed data. We're looking at crash data. Generally speaking, we found that all these things are aligned, making the street, a transit priority street allocates space in such a way that crash rates go down. Certainly, crash rates that involve serious injuries and fatalities go down, and speeding and reckless driving goes down as well. So we think everything is aligned on this.
Well, fantastic. This is an excellent presentation. Thank you for answering all these questions and providing so much great information. I want to thank Carolyn Eswine for all of her great hosting of the other Innovative Cities lectures in the semester prior to this. In the spring, we have another set of lectures coming your way, so you will be getting emails over winter break. Be looking out for those and be ready for our February 4th lecture on the impacts of ecotourism. Thanks again to Kevin and Dan, and thanks to everybody for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.